In the 1800s, the railroads faced a problem. Farm labor shortages along their newly expanded westward lines threatened profitability. Not surprisingly, in 1853, they jumped at the chance to support a New York City minister's idea, an early version of foster care that would find homes for the city's orphans on farms in the Midwest.
They were told, your parents are not your parents, your past is not your past, your life begins when you are chosen. The orphan trains began because a Methodist minister in New York City named Charles Loring Brace looked around the streets of New York and saw that there were 30,000 children living on the streets. They were getting run over, dying of starvation and exposure, going to jail, becoming criminals, they were becoming prostitutes. What we think of as Dickensian London is really what it was like then for poor people. Immigrants were pouring in, the Industrial Revolution was replacing jobs for poor people with machines, the Civil War was raging and creating vulnerable war widows. So there are many reasons that there were all these children on the streets. And Brace had this idea, it was sort of a glorified fresh air fund. He thought, if I can get children off the streets and send them to farms in the Midwest where labor is needed, maybe we can save their lives and maybe we can clean up the streets of New York. He worked with the train companies to send children on trains to the Midwest, and the trains each held between 10 and 30 children. And over the course of the next 75 years, over 250,000 children were sent to the Midwest. There were two ways that people got children from the orphan trains. The Foundling Hospital, which got into the act a little bit later, would put notices in newspapers around the Midwest, and people would write in and say, I'd like a blonde, curly-haired, blue-eyed, 7-year-old boy with a sweet disposition. And so they would look around and find that child and put him on a train, and then that person would be waiting on the other end. The Children's Aid Society had the children line up by height at a train platform or at a city hall or a Grange hall. Then farmers or whoever came would often, not unlike a slave auction, have them run in place, check their teeth, check their muscles, have them do even sit-ups or push-ups to make sure they were strong because they wanted workers. The farmers would take them off the stage and then fill out certificates taking ownership of the child. Contracts were signed between the people who took the train riders in and the organization, the Children's Aid Society or the Foundling Hospital, and it says, shall be indentured until the age of 21. These children were 2 to 14 years old. 21 is quite a long time to be working for someone else. The people who took in the train riders were required to send them to school, 4 months of schooling a year, to feed and clothe them. There was some language about treating them as you would one of your own. However, they were labor. For some of them, it was actually a form of slavery. Many of them had no choice but do what they were told to do. There were volunteers in communities who were supposed to check in on the children. That was rather spotty as a process. For one thing, they were volunteers. And because children were property, even if someone went out to check on a situation, it was much more likely that the adults would be believed than that the child would be believed. Furthermore, there was a great disincentive to take children out of homes because it was so hard then to know what to do with them. And so they would often leave children in situations that were not really the best for them. It was an imperfect system, and what it meant is that it was absolutely a roulette wheel. And the children had no choice about where they were going, and the people who took in the train riders were as varied as human nature. There were very good people, very kind people who took in train riders, and there were also people who weren't so good and kind. Even if the people who took them in were kind, they often treated them as a little bit less than family. One of the reasons we don't know much, that most people don't know much about the orphan trains, is that the train riders themselves didn't realize that they were part of this large movement. 250,000 children go on these trains, and most of them think that their train was the only one that went. So you can see why they didn't organize more quickly or reach out to each other. I was so lucky. When I began this book, there were 150 living train riders. Today, there are probably between 10 and 20. It was such a gift. I had access to living train riders and could interview them. One of the most significant was a woman named Pat Thiessen. Even at the age of 93, she felt the loss and the sort of sorrow. She said, "They were good people, but they were not my people." As one train rider said to me, we had been through so much turmoil and so much trauma. Every child who rode the orphan train had been through something terrible. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been there because the trains were the last resort.
Prairie Mosaic is funded by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund with money from the vote of the people of Minnesota on November 4th, 2008. The North Dakota Council on the Arts, and by the members of Prairie Public.